For this episode of the Transcendent Knowledge podcast, we thought we would take a radical excursion into something completely different, but also strongly related to the topics we normally talk about. So we're going to talk about the practical side of growing mushrooms for personal consumption. And in particular, I thought I would run through the most ultra basic technique that exists, which is super easy. Actually, it has to be said that of all the different psychoactive drugs that there are, I think mushrooms are by far the easiest one to be self-sufficient in. You only need very basic, access to a kitchen and a small amount of not even specialist equipment, and you can get a pretty good quantity of mushrooms. But there is lots of different ways of doing it, and they get more and more progressively advanced. But I thought just stick to the absolute basic ones for a beginner, someone who had never done it before. And there's all sorts of different opinions about this on the internet, and there are a lot of people who don't like this particular method that I'm going to spell out, and would advise that people try to start off just by going straight for the slightly more advanced methods. But that's not how I've ever done it myself. So it's a particular technique called cakes. Like it used to be called PF tech because there was an American guy who called himself Psilocybe Fanaticus, who created this particular technique of doing things. And so for many years, this technique was called PF tech, but nowadays people tend to call it rice flour cake tech or something like that. Basically, it involves creating cakes, like solid lumps of mushroom mycelium, which then are allowed to grow out, and then mushrooms start to sprout out from the cakes. So the technique basically involves learning how to make the cakes, and then learning how to make them become fully grown with fungus, and then learning how to harvest them. So does that make sense so far?
It does, yes. We're going to be baking a little bit, it sounds like.
Yeah, basically, yeah. I think it's probably even easier than that. But one of the first pieces of equipment you're going to need is potentially a pressure cooker. Now, it can be done without a pressure cooker, but it makes it much more likely to succeed, much less likely to fail with a pressure cooker than without, because pressure cookers can reach about like 102 degrees, which is the optimal temperature for sterilization, because when you're doing this, everything has to be sterile. It's a general type of technique called pure culture, which is where you only have one specific type of DNA, one specific species growing within a particular area, and you have to make it completely absent of any competitor organisms or anything that might try to compete for the nutrients. And the way you do that is with heat. So a pressure cooker is the way to get the heat. And another thing that you need is the right shape of jar, and it has to be, so it's basically you're using small, about like half pint sized glass jars to make the cakes in. So the cakes end up taking the shape of the jar, but you need specifically to have a jar that doesn't have a shoulder on the top, because the thing that you're going to be growing on the inside of the jar is going to end up being completely solid. So if the jar has a shoulder, like the curve at the top near to the lid, that's going to prevent your cake from coming out of the jar when you want to get it out.
The opening of the jar should be the same width as the jar itself.
Exactly.
It should
yes.
narrow at the top. Okay.
Yeah, and like 99% of jam jars do actually narrow at the top. There's only really one design of jar that doesn't. And I don't know if you can get it in the States, but there's actually a French company called Bon Mammon who make this type of jam, and they always use that shape of jar. I'm sure it's available in the States, but I don't know if that particular company will export their jam there. But I don't know if this particular shape has a generic name for it, but it might take some shopping around to find it. But it's the shape is the all important thing, and also these jars are specifically designed to be made sterile on the inside and airtight,
Right.
no matter what they use for, even if they're used for jam or storing preserved food or anything like
Right.
that. So
Right.
they have like a small rubber ring around the inside of the jar lid, which creates an airtight seal when you screw it on. So once you've got those, I tend to find that if you get a 5 liter pressure cooker, you can comfortably fit 4 of those shaped jars into the pressure cooker in one go. So you end up doing it 4 by 4. Like each kind of batch or round of jars, it's always in 4s.
I mean, this is essentially very similar to creating preserves, which I have some experience with.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Well, yes, if you have the experience with that, then you'll basically get the technique. It's using high heat to seal jars closed with sterile ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
However, you need to modify the jar lid in order to introduce the mushroom genetics into the jar. That's one area where it differs. So the way to do that is to punch some holes into the lid of the jar. You need maybe 2, 3, 4 holes in the lid of the jar, which need to be at least big enough to fit the needle of a syringe through the hole. So you need to make the holes, but then you need to cover them up with some kind of filter paper of some kind. So you get like medical plasters on a roll, which that's one way of doing it. Medical tape, I think it's called, and you can stick that over the holes that you make. And there's also what you could, for example, stick filter paper over the holes, something like that. But some way of creating a filtered air exchange intake in the lid of the jar. So it has 2 purposes. The holes. One purpose is to allow you to inject the mushroom spores into your substrate. And another purpose is to, once the fungus is growing on the inside of the jar, it's going to need some air, some fresh air, and a place to get rid of the excess carbon dioxide that builds up.
But these are relatively small holes.
Yeah, relatively small, yes. Just not that much larger than the syringe needle, which is only tiny. It's only like maybe a millimeter across.
Mm-hmm.
So once you've got your empty glass jars with the holes in the lid and your filter paper covering the holes.
May I ask about the filter paper more? How is that attached?
So the way I've always done it is to use medical tape, which is sticky all the way through. It's like a regular sticky tape.
And put that over the top, on the inside of the lid.
Oh, no, I would always put it on the outside of the lid. Because once you've done the sterilizing and you've got your jar, you're going to need access to the filter paper. You're going to need a way of temporarily removing it so that you can inject the spores and then sticking it back down after you've done that. And the only way to do that is to have it on the outside of the lid. So you need to put it on the lid, and then that's going to then need to go into the pressure cooker like that. So does that all make sense? Like having jars that are modified in this special particular way?
It does, yes.
Another ingredient that you're going to need is the actual spores. And fortunately, they seem to be legal pretty much everywhere. Like, I think the only places I've ever heard of that have actually made mushroom spores illegal is, I think it's California and Georgia in the States. And I think pretty much everywhere else in the world, even places like, strongly prohibitionist places like France and Australia, you can still obtain mushroom spores very easily. It seems a strange situation because they come directly out of something which is illegal, but because they don't contain, the spores themselves don't contain any psilocybin. It's impossible to trip from just the spores, so that's why they're legal. And they come typically in two forms. One form is the spore print, which is directly what you take from an actual mushroom. If you cut the top of a mushroom off and lay it down flat onto a piece of foil, and then leave it for about 12 hours, you'll get a spore print. But that needs to then have one more step applied to it before it can be used in the production of these cakes of solid mushroom mycelium, and that is, it needs to be put into a syringe in order to actually apply it to your mushroom substrate. But you don't actually have to do that technique yourself, because they are also available like that widely and legally on the internet. So there's one website called sporeworks.com, I think, and there's Ralphster's spores. I can't think of any more names off the top of my head, but there's plenty of supply companies that provide spores, and different ones have different reputations. And I have no experience with the American company, so I wouldn't be able to recommend any particular one, but they're probably all basically going to be the same. There's one major thing to watch out for, which is if the syringe is already contaminated. So it needs to come from a reputable place, just to make sure that it has been created in a sterile environment.
Obvious, right. So do you have a sense of how to judge that?
The only way to judge that is to actually try it, to actually use it in a mushroom grow, and by the time you find out if it's clean, if it's got any contamination on it, it will already be too late. You'll have some kind of mold or bacteria growing when you try and grow it. But by that point, you'll know that it's actually difficult to determine the origin of an infection, some kind of contamination, if you have it. So it's not always 100% guaranteed. You might use a spore syringe and get an infection, but it might not actually originate from the syringe itself. So there's a lot of you've just got to basically hope for the best, that it's been created in a clean atmosphere, and just do everything as cleanly as you possibly can. So cleanliness and sterility is a very big aspect of mushroom growing. You really have to. It's a discipline. Part of the discipline is really keeping everything as clean as you possibly can, and there are various ways of doing that.
So would you recommend that someone clean thoroughly the workspace, for example, kitchen counter, wherever one is doing it?
Yes. That's really like a major standard part of just all along. You just need to get used to, at every stage of the process of growing mushrooms, you have to generally get used to working in a high cleanliness environment. And so you can use things like diluted solution of bleach is very good for removing any kind of bacteria or molds from surfaces. It's a good idea to hoover, because that filters the air, and you get a lot of the particles that are floating around in the air will be caught in a filter of a hoover. And yeah, so that kind of thing. Also keeping your hands very clean and fresh, and even something like if you scratch your nose in the middle of doing it, there's a potential that you're going to there's going to be a spread of contamination. So you need to be very mindful of everything being clean and what is contacting with what, and any potential avenue through which bacteria or mold spores can spread. So cleanliness is the name of the game. And if also one additional thing that is good is to work in an environment where the air is relatively still. So it's better to work in a room with a closed door than it is to work in a room with any kind of breeze, any kind of movement of air, because movement of air can transfer spores onto surfaces, which will then hatch and spoil a grow. But that kind of thing, that just happens with time. And also you can never be 100% guaranteed that you're not going to, no workspace is completely sterile. And in growing mushrooms, contamination is a fact of life. So it's more about minimizing it rather than eliminating it completely. And where it does happen, you need to deal with it in the appropriate way, which means to isolate it and remove it from your grow area as quickly as possible and not allow it to become established, because it will start to heavily, it will get worse and worse, and it will start to heavily prevent, any efforts at growing mushrooms if it's allowed to get too far. So there's a general, there's a name for this, which is called sterile technique, and that's used throughout many different types of scientific experimentation and industrial processes and that kind of thing, where sterility has to be maintained. And there's a number of different ways, different techniques. A part of it is chemical. You can even get things like ultraviolet lights, which sterilize an area. But you don't really need to go too overboard with it. But as a general guide, this comes from the great magic mycologist Paul Stamets. He's written a number of books about how to cultivate mushrooms. In fact, most of my information basically comes from him. Like I learned how to grow mushrooms from reading Paul Stamets. And what he has said is that you really need to aim for a maximum of 10% as a general guideline. That if you're getting more than 10% of contamination in your total amount that you're growing, then you're doing something wrong. But up to 10% is basically okay, and that's just a fact of life, and you've got to deal with it and treat it appropriately when it does occur. So it's all I'm saying is that it's impossible to get rid of it completely, because contamination just seems to be everywhere. It's floating in the air, it's on every surface, and it's completely invisible, that kind of thing. But it's the major obstacle that you come across when you're growing mushrooms. Like I've said about how super easy it is and how you can be self-sufficient in mushrooms just by having access to a kitchen and the right ingredients. But this is the thing that will stop you if anything does. It's the presence of contamination in the environment. So it's always kind of there in the background. But anyway, to get back to the list of ingredients. So you've got your pressure cooker, you've got your modified glass jars, and you've got your Psilocybe Cubensis spore syringes. Then you're ready to go. Like the only other thing you need then is a substrate to create the cakes out of. And there's quite a few different ingredients that you can use. But the standard one, which is the original way that this technique was done specifically, just consists of vermiculite, which is a soil additive, which is hygroscopic, I think the word is. It absorbs water, and so it creates like a water supply for the fungus to use, but it's also non-nutritive. It has no nutritive value, so it doesn't get digested or metabolized by the fungus mycelium. It stays completely whole. And the other ingredient is brown rice flour, which if you want, you can make it yourself just by taking brown rice and putting it into a spice grinder. But you can also buy it commercially. And I've always found that it's better to buy it commercially, even though it costs a little bit more. The way the industrial grinding process works always makes a finer powder than I've ever been able to achieve using an electric grinder.
And that in itself is fairly easily available. Brown rice flour, I see it at grocery stores all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Grocery stores, health food stores, and vermiculite is always available in gardening stores. It's very commonly used in gardening. So there's nothing that is difficult to get in this whole process. The only thing that is even slightly kind of unusual or not part of like mass high street kind of market is the spores, but they're also very well catered for with spore supply companies on the internet. So it's all part of how easy it is to grow mushrooms in general, is how easy it is to acquire all the relevant ingredients.
Right.
The next step is to create the optimal substrate to fill your jars with. And to do that, you need to mix together water and rice flour and vermiculite in the correct proportion, and the proportion is two. So let's say you've got I said about doing it 4 jars at a time because 4 jars will fit into the pressure cooker in one go. So if you take your 4 jars and you lay them out, fill one of them with water and one of them with brown rice flour, and then the remaining 2 you fill with vermiculite. That is a good way of basically measuring the proportions between the 4 jars. If you combine those ingredients together and then mix them really well, you'll end up with like a sticky, it's not really like soil, but it's a sticky mix of rice flour and vermiculite basically. And then you have to load that into your jars. And one thing that's quite important at that point is getting the water content right. You don't want it to be too sludgy and moist, because that will create it'll create pockets inside the jar where the air can't get to. But also you don't want it to be too dry, because it will dry out and the fungus won't be able to fully colonize the cake.
Right, so a happy medium of water.
Yes, not too slimy and sticky, and not too dry. And that's something you kind of get a feel for as you've done it, after you've done it multiple times.
Now, one question, sorry, here on the jar size. Did you say half pint?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's exactly half a pint, but it's very close to half a pint. These typical shoulderless jars tend to be about half a pint, or 500 milliliters, something like that. But as long as they are all the same, as long as all 4 jars are the same size, it doesn't really matter. And as long as they fit inside the pressure cooker, and as long as the lids are modified in the right way, then it doesn't really matter the size. But I've always found that there's another thing, which is it's good to leave about maybe 0.5 centimeter to 1 centimeter empty at the top of the jar, because one thing you need to do is clean round the rim of the jar really well, because that is if there's any kind of residue around the lid of the jar, that can form a kind of a bridge for bacteria to invade, to kind of climb into the jar. So there needs to be, the jar is full of substrate, but then there's a small clean area around the rim. And another thing that is good to do, I think, is to put a bit of dry vermiculite, just a few spoonfuls, just to coat the top underneath the lid after you've put your substrate into the jar. So they're full of substrate, and then they've got a tiny layer of dry vermiculite, and then you screw the lid on top of that. And again, that dry vermiculite layer acts as a barrier to stop any kind of infection getting into the jar before it's become fully colonized. Because once it is fully colonized, you hardly need to worry about getting infected anymore, because it's got its own biological resistance to becoming infected. It's only where you've got uncolonized substrate that is can easily become infected if you're not careful. So now you've got your jars of substrate, but they're not sterile. They haven't yet been in the pressure cooker. So if you leave them in that position, like after about maybe 48 hours, they're going to start to smell funny, like sour or moldy kind of smell, and then they go bad. So you need to sterilize them as soon as possible, and that just involves loading them into a pressure cooker and cooking them on full pressure for 1 hour. I do like 70 minutes just to be on the safe side. I think, around then. And if you don't have a pressure cooker, you need to cook them in a pan with a lid on for like 1.5, 2 hours maybe, just to give that additional time to ensure that it is absolutely sterilized. And there's a number of important safety precautions around using pressure cookers, which is really important to observe, like not to let the pressure cooker dry out while it's in the middle of cooking, because then the temperature will go up, and it can cause problems. I should say, actually, regarding pressure cookers, you have 2 main options if you in purchasing pressure cookers. You can get the stovetop pressure cookers, which are just like a regular large pan, but it's got this specially modified lid, which is airtight and has a pressure gauge, pressure seal on it. Or you can get electric ones. And personally, I would highly recommend investing in an electric pressure cooker if this is something that you're going to be doing multiple times and like a hobby that you're going to get into seriously, because they're such a pleasure to use. They cost about 2 or 3 times more than a stovetop pressure cooker costs, but they are a real joy.
But it's a worthy investment.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like, for years, I used to use a stovetop pressure cooker, but when I finally discovered electric pressure cookers, it was the best investment I ever made. They're super ergonomic compared to stovetop pressure cookers, much easier to use and just much less hassle. It's just it reduces the process of heating up and having to keep an constant eye on your stovetop pressure cooker. It reduces that whole thing to just basically pushing a button, and then you can leave it alone. You can even leave it overnight, and it's just all on a timer, so it does all the hard work for you, basically.
Oh, I see. Yeah, modern convenience. Now, what size of pressure cooker do you recommend to handle these 4 jars, for example?
I think it's 4 or 5 liters. I'm not exactly sure. I think maybe 5 liters is the right type to get, but it's probably worth kind of I suppose it depends. If you buy something on the internet, you can't really see it in advance, but if you go to a store to get something, you can actually like look and just double check that you can fit 4 jars without without kind of stacking them up dangerously or anything like that. They should all be at the base of the cooking area, all resting on the bottom, but without too much room around it. So some pressure cookers are absolutely enormous, and you can fit like 16 jars at the same time in them, but they tend to be much more aimed at much more industrial processes. They don't even call them pressure cookers when they get that big. They call them autoclaves, but you don't really want something like an autoclave, because I'm really talking about the very domestic, personal use kind of level of mushroom growing. But a lot of people don't settle for that, and they do cash cropping, which is very large amounts, and you can cook maybe up to 16 jars at the same time. But that's not really the level that I'm addressing. I'm just talking about someone who wants to create a modest monthly amount of mushrooms just to kind of feed himself and friends and immediate people, rather than kind of going into business with them, if you see what I mean. So I think that I'm pretty sure it's 5 liters is the size that you're going to want. And then so you need to put enough water into the pressure cooker so that it comes about 1/3 of the way up the jars that are inside. You don't want it to go too high up the jars, because they're boiling. If it starts getting a lot of liquid water on top of the jars, it can get inside the jars, and then you increase your moisture content, which you don't want to do. So the guideline for how much to fill your jars is that it should come up about 1/3 of the way up fill the pressure pot. It should come up about 1/3 of the way up the jars, and that's the perfect amount of water to use. And then you close the lid on the pressure cooker and set it on high pressure to cook for 1 hour. And then there's a lengthy process. When it's finished 1 hour of cooking, you then let it depressurize naturally. So you don't release the pressure valve to depressurize it quickly. You just let the pressure gradually subside. And I find the best way to do that really is overnight, because it takes hours for it to cool down all the way back down to room temperature. And it's very important to give it the time to fully cool down before you do anything else with it. So set the pressure cooker, leave it for an hour, let it switch off or turn the heat off, and then give it multiple hours to cool all the way down, so that you end up with a jar that is room temperature at the end of it. And it's important not to open the pressure cooker before it's fully cooled down, because if you have a situation where the air inside the jar is cooling down very quickly, then the air is going to shrink, and you're going to pull a lot of air from the surroundings into the jar, which can create problems with contamination if you're not careful. So you need to let the the different air pressures to regulate naturally and slowly come to a equilibrium point before you open the jars. Sorry, you don't open the jars. I mean, before you open the pressure cooker. So does that all make sense? So at the end of that process, you've now got 4 jars which are sealed and they're sterile and they're full of substrate, right?
Yes, except that, they're sealed except for the 3 to 4 holes in the top, and they're covered in medical tape, for example, or some sort of what's the word I want? Gauze that allows for air to pass through.
Yes, the holes just have to be very small, which is what they're designed for, a sterile airflow. So big enough to allow air to flow through, but too small to allow any kind of particle or potentially spore or some kind of contamination to get through.
Mm-hmm. And the filter paper is on top throughout the pressurizing process.
Yes, it is, and it should stay. It's because the water is at the bottom of the jars. It shouldn't really get too wet. It always ends up getting a bit wet, but it has to stay on, and there has to be an airtight seal around the filter paper. So some kind of you could glue it on if you wanted, and a lot of people use. There's a special type of glue that you can get, which is impermeable to heat, which can be useful for that kind of thing. Although I've always found that that's a bit overkill and you don't really need that. And if you use medical tape, the stickiness on the medical tape itself should be fine to withstand the heat. But you know that something's going wrong if your jars are becoming infected and you don't understand why. Right. And if the infection is visibly on the top of the jars, then you know that there's a problem with the contamination coming in the top. Although I've never had a problem with that personally. I find just sticking 4 pieces of medical tape, one piece of medical tape for each hole in the lid is plenty to create a safe, sterile environment in that regard. So now you've got your 4 jars. They're now ready to actually be inoculated with the mushroom spores. So the way to do that, you've got your spore syringes, and that's like basically a sterile syringe full of water, and there's some spores floating around inside the water.
Wait, excuse me, Max, just to back up. At what point in this process does one inject the spore syringe into the substrate?
That's the part that we're coming on to next.
That's what we're coming to next. Gotcha.
Because they're now ready to be inoculated. Yeah, the word for introducing spores into the substrate is called inoculation. So that's the next step. But you can only do that after you have sterilized the 4 jars. So once the jars are sterile and they're at room temperature, now is the time to introduce your spores into the substrate.
Okay.
So the way to do that is basically just to inject through the hole. So you've got your spore syringe, which is a syringe full of water with spores floating around. And you can often see visibly, even though they're very small, you can see the black dots floating around in the water. That kind of reassures you that there are spores there. Although there are some more unscrupulous spore vendors will often try to dilute the spores as much as they can so that they can squeeze every bit of profit and money out of selling the spores. So sometimes they're not completely visible. Sometimes it can be very difficult to have any awareness that there's anything in the spores other than just plain water. But then a lot of spore vendors also use as a marketing point that there's so much spores inside the water that you can see it, and they often even clump together. So you get big lumps of like a solid clump of black spores inside the syringe. But basically what you have to do now is to inject some spores into your sterile substrate cakes through the holes in the lids of the jar. And you need to be aware that you're creating, it's like every time you do any transfer of genetic material from one place to another, that is when you create a weak point at which you can get a potential infection, because you're opening up uncolonized substrate to the local natural environment, which is always going to be, to some extent, there's going to be some kind of contamination floating around. And for example, it's much worse during the summer months when the temperature goes up. You get a lot more microorganisms and spores and that kind of thing floating around in the air. And then during the colder months of the year, it's actually easier to grow mushrooms because there's less contamination floating around, because the conditions are much more hostile for contamination to flourish. So that's just something that you need to deal with. As I said, you're always going to get some contamination, but you can minimize it by being as clean as possible, and also by the way that you make the movement is quite important. Like it needs to be relatively fast moving, very deliberate, precise movements, but not so fast that you start to make mistakes, start to kind of have accidents. So it's kind of a balance between speed and accuracy and precision, in terms of you've got to open up the holes and then put the syringe into the hole, inject a small squirt of the spore water into your substrate, and do it through multiple holes. You could do it through 2 holes, like on either side of the jar lid, or maybe 3, maybe even 4. But you probably really only need, say, 2 or 3 injections in the jar, and you should point them towards the outside of the jar, so the point where the substrate meets the inside of the glass, because then it's very easy to see visibly when the spores start to grow on the inside. You get a white growth. Basically, the white growth is the sign of the healthy mushroom mycelium starting to grow on the inside. So you've squirted a little bit of spore water, spore solution, at different points inside the glass.
And is the syringe piercing into the substrate, or are you squirting on top?
You're not really squirting on top, and you're not really piercing it into the substrate. It's more like you're squirting it down the edge, down the side of the glass. So you wouldn't have to do it this way, but this is always the way that I have done it, and I think that there's a lot of tutorial videos of how to do it on the internet, and a lot of people have written about this, and this generally seems the way to do it. I think is to aim the syringe outwards towards so say the holes in your lid are close to the edge. They mustn't be so close to the edge that they affect the sealing of the jar, or the rubber ring around the inside of the top of the jar. But you want them kind of around the edge at different points, spaced out evenly around the edge, depending on how many there are. And then when you put the syringe into the hole, you aim it towards the side of the jar, so that it'll dribble down the inside of the substrate where the substrate meets the glass. And then, so you've done that multiple times. You then take the syringe back out and put the lid back onto the syringe, and you then have to put the filter paper back on, so that make sure that there's the filtered seal back on each of the holes. So you momentarily take it off. You could, if you wanted, just pierce through your medical tape or your filter paper with the syringe needle, and then put a second piece on top as soon as you pull it out. Do you see what I mean? Or you could peel it back and then put the needle into the hole, and then when you take it out, you could stick it back down again. So that's just a question of technique, and I don't really know if either of those 2 techniques would be better. But what you're trying to do is create a sterile transfer of spores from the syringe into the jars.
No, I imagine that here, especially this moment of sealing back up the jar and covering up the syringe, requires, as you said, the fast and not fast, but the deliberate movement to not. This seems like a moment of, on either end, with the syringe on the one hand and with the jar being open, that contamination could occur.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's basically the whole process of growing mushrooms involves 2 separate things. One of them is transfer, and the other is incubation. So you make a transfer of genetics and then you incubate, and then you make another transfer and then you incubate. And what you're saying is it's at the point where you make the transfer that creates a weak point for infection. It's very unlikely to happen during the incubation period when all you're doing is waiting for the fungus to grow, because there's no movement of material from one place to another at that point. You're just holding it isolated inside a receptacle and allowing it to grow. But then when it grows to when you need to move on to the next step, you then need to make a transfer, and it's when the transfer occurs that you can introduce foreign contamination into the process. So this is one example of that. Mm-hmm. So once you've done it, you then have to seal back up the holes so that they're filtered again. And then you need to go into the incubation period. So you've now got sterile substrate with spores inside it, and you then need to put that in a place which is, I mean, it can be room temperature, but ideally it should be slightly above room temperature. And actually that brings me on to another important piece of specialist equipment that you could invest in. I mean, this is actually very cheap, but you don't need it specifically, but it will help the process along by adding a bit of temperature to it. And that's a reptile heating pad. I think you could get them for maybe about £10, what's that, $15 or something. It's like a square of plastic, like thin plastic, which plugs into the mains, and it uses about 15 watts. I think it's not like a high energy thing, but it then just creates a warm area, so it warms up, but not very much. So it's not hot at all. It's like just warm, and the way that that's typically used is when people are keeping reptiles inside a terrarium. You use a reptile heating pad so that they can, because they're cold-blooded, so that they can warm up their blood so they can start moving around. And I think there's also other variations of this. Like you can get heating pads for cats and dogs, I think, and there may be other examples too. But you want just an area that stays slightly warmer than the rest of than room temperature, basically. It's like a pad. So if you put your jars on top of a reptile heating pad that has been plugged in, that will keep them warm and that will encourage the spore growth on the inside. So after a couple of days, so first to start with, it's just dormant and not much happened. But after a couple of days, it could be even up to like a week, maybe even more than a week. The spores on the inside will start to hatch and create strands of mycelium, which is this white growth that you get, and you start to see that on the side of the jars. This is a reason why it's good to aim the needle towards the edge of the jar instead of doing it right into the middle, is so that you can then visibly identify when it starts to grow. And that's also important for spotting contamination. It's important that it's on the outside where it's next to the glass rather than deep inside the cake, because then if any contamination arises, you can see it sooner. You want to be able to identify things like that sooner rather than later. So you will see fungus start to grow inside the jar, and then it's just a matter of waiting, and it should be maybe about 3 or 4 weeks, possibly a bit longer than that, depending on the vigor of the genetics of the spores that you've used, because some spores are better than others. Some spores have more vigorous, better genetics than others. So if you've got a good quality, vigorous spore syringe, then you might end up with a fully colonized fungus cake within about 4 weeks. But during that 4 weeks, you need to be constantly on the lookout for any sign of contamination starting to form inside the jars. And you have 2 different senses that you use to identify contamination. You're seeing and you're smelling. So, and also there's 2 fundamentally different types of contamination. One of them is bacterial contamination and the other one is mould. And generally speaking, you can identify mould primarily with your eyes, by looking at the jars, and you identify bacteria primarily with your nose, because if it starts to grow, you can't really see bacteria grow, but you can smell it. It starts to smell rotten or like stale, or sometimes it smells like vinegary. There's a variety of different smells that you need to start to learn to identify for picking up contamination. And also, if it's mold, there's a variety of different visual formations that mold can take. So the most typical one, I think, is the blue-green penicillin mold that you always get. Like if you open up a loaf of bread and then you seal it up, and then you leave it for a while, you get like a growth of green, kind of greeny blue on the bread. That is a very common mold which is floating about everywhere. So that's going to be quite likely something that you will eventually encounter. But there's also many others. Some of them are like even bright red, some of them are jet black. There's a wide variety of different colors and forms, visual forms, and even smells that you get of contamination. Obviously, anything like that you don't want. That's something that you want to seek out and catch at the earliest possible opportunity. And if you catch it, you need to immediately remove it from your grow area and dispose of it sterile in the safest way you possibly can, which basically is putting it at the bottom of a bin, or burying it somewhere far away from where you're doing the grow, or something like that. If you really want to be super careful, it's slightly overkill in my opinion, but some people will recommend that if you have a jar which becomes infected, you re-sterilize it. You need to put it back into the pressure cooker for an hour, and then it's completely safe you could just chuck it in the bin, chuck the contents of it in the bin at the end of that. Although I've never done that personally. I think all you need to do is just make sure that it's away, isolated from your grow area, so there's no way that it will release spores into the environment, which will then somehow sneak back into your growing process, because that will start to cause problems. But it's important to be aware of how incredibly efficient mold is at spreading via spores, because it starts to create spores straight away. So there's a tiny amount of mycelial growth with mold, but then the mycelium turns into spores. And as soon as it starts to create spores, you only need to get even a tiny air current, or if you just tap it very lightly with your finger, you'll get a cloud of spores will be released into the atmosphere and will float and distribute themselves, and they will stick to surfaces and they will hang about in the air. So, mold...
And through the filter paper.
I mean, that depends. Ideally, they shouldn't be able to get through the filter paper, but there's also a different quality of filter paper. Some is better than others, and it has to be truly medical grade to be able to really eliminate any kind of introduction of spores through the air pockets, through the holes, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, filter paper is quite safe, and you just need to be very mindful of of keeping a clean and mold-free environment for the incubation to occur.
Yeah. So it's interesting conceptually. We have there's competing mycelium strands that are competing for this nice, this nice grow environment that we create. And we want the one sort to grow and not the other sort to grow.
Yes, that's right. And it's important to point out, I think, how completely different this way of growing fungus is compared to the way that it ever grows in nature. It's completely different because in nature, there's never a situation where you have a pure culture of something, a pure DNA. Yeah. There's always thousands and thousands of different competitor organisms all vying for the same space all the time, and somehow out of that total chaotic mutual competition between all these different species, they all find their own niche and their own place to grow. So you'll get magic mushrooms growing alongside mold, growing alongside all sorts of green plants, all in the same vicinity. But when you're doing it this way, you're doing it completely differently to nature, and you are isolating one specific type of mycelium and keeping everything else away. So that situation of having a lump of completely uncolonized, sterile substrate, that you never get that anywhere in nature, basically. So this is a very modern, very kind of scientific way of doing it. This is a modern technique, and I think that's that in a way links to some of the other topics that you and I have spoken about, some of the other topics that are very relevant to the ego death theory. There's one major question, which Michael Hoffman has addressed actually, about supply of drugs in antiquity. And this technique is not something that would ever have been done by the ancient Greeks or the ancient Egyptians, anything like that. They wouldn't have had these techniques available to them. The history of mycology and mycoculture really doesn't go back very far. It only goes back barely 150 years, I think. You used to have French farmers who would find an area of land where you would get a large amount of some kind of mushroom, and so they would just dig up a load of the soil from that area and then pile it together in one place, and they would find, eventually they developed techniques for, you'd get a slightly higher amount of that mushroom growing in this area because of the way that they had consolidated the soil in this way. But it wasn't until, I think, the late 1800s, there was a French scientist called Louis Pasteur. Actually, the word pasteurize comes from his name, and he created the technique of heat sterilization, which is to say you heat something to a very high temperature in order to completely eliminate every single microorganism that is present in there. So all I'm really saying is these are very recent techniques, and they're very they're I guess you could say strongly artificial, strongly a product of modern technology, because even that thing where you've got the rubber seal around the lid of the jar, that's a very modern thing, and it creates a huge difference. You never would be able to do this were it not for that little ring of rubber creating the airtight seal at the top of the jar. But anyway, I'm digressing. So you've got your jars which are now incubating with magic mushroom mycelium. You've eliminated any of the infected jars, you've got them away. So what you're left with is a number of jars which are growing completely pure psilocybe mycelium in them. Eventually, they will completely colonize the entire cake of fungus that is inside the jar. So there will no longer be any visible areas of uncolonized substrate, any uncolonized rice and vermiculite mix. That's kind of the brown color, and the fungus is a very vibrant, clean white color. So now there's no more brown at all, and it's completely white. Now, when you're in that situation, you've done the hardest part of it. Once you've got a fully colonized jar of fully colonized substrate, which is just basically one big cake of fungus, then you're on the home run after that. You've done the really tough part of mushroom cultivation, and the rest of it's quite easy. You need to probably give it about another week to grow, even when all of the brown part has disappeared and been overtaken by the white part. Give it another week so that the very inside of the cake can become fully colonized, and so that the fungus gets a very good grip over the substrate, so that it's fully colonized, fully grown out, and it no longer has any fresh nutrients available to it. And it's when it runs out of nutrients like that, when it has fully colonized, taken up all the available substrate, that seems to be when the whatever kind of biological whatever biological indicator for it to start producing mushrooms is. So the next step after that is to actually get your mushrooms. But you could, if you wanted to be really safe and never open it up to the air, you could actually leave it inside the jar and just allow it to grow out. But there's so little room inside the jar for mushrooms to form that you'll end up getting a load of crushed mushrooms. And that's not a very optimal way of doing it. But some people do it that way. Some people never open up the jar. But the far more effective way of doing it is to then create a separate growing environment for your mushrooms. some kind of terrarium, or basically the way I do it, I only use a plastic box. You don't need any kind of specialist glass terrarium or anything like that. You just need a plastic box. Doesn't even have to be an airtight seal at the top, but it does have to be some kind of seal. Like, it can't just be open to the air. It basically needs to be a closable plastic box or some kind of box-like container. And then what I do is to put a small amount of perlite on the bottom of the box. So first of all, give it a really good clean, and ideally use some bleach solution or some kind of actual special antiseptic to clean the inside of the jar. That's not really necessary maybe the first time you use it, but after subsequently you've used it multiple times, it's important to make sure that it's clean. But then when you've cleaned it, you should also give it a really good rinse with just plain water, so that there's no chemicals left on the inside of the box, because that can affect the growth of the fungus. But one important point actually at this stage is that once the substrate jar is fully colonized, you no longer have to really worry about contamination anymore. It's now got its own resistance against contamination. And even though contamination can still occur, you can still get growth of mould on the surface of the cakes. It can still get bacterial infection. It's very much less likely to happen. And you'd have to be really, have a very dirty environment, have very poor hygiene procedures at this point for it to become affected. So that becomes much less of a worry, which is really one of the main reasons I said that at this point you've done all of the hard work. You've done the hardest part. Really now it's just a question of time before the mushrooms start to appear. But so let's say you've got your clean plastic box, and optionally you can add a bit of perlite to the bottom. And perlite is very similar to vermiculite. It's a soil additive, but the main difference is instead of being water absorbing, it's actually hydrophobic. It will repel water. Mm-hmm. So you can put a small layer of perlite on the bottom of this plastic container that you have, and then a little bit of water. Not enough water that there's any sitting puddles of water anywhere. They have to be it has to be almost invisible, just droplets of water. But you need to create basically a humid environment on the inside of this box, because that's the natural environment that Psilocybe cubensis grows in, is humid countries. Like, it grows in places like Mexico and Thailand and Indonesia, places like that, where there's high temperature but also a very high water content in the air. So you don't get mushrooms in desert environments. You only get them where there's humidity and lots of green plant life. So if you've got a box that's got a small layer of perlite on the bottom and quite a high moisture content in the air, so you'll be able to feel the wetness of the air, and also there'll be droplets condensing on the sides and the lid of the box because of the high water content. That is a perfect environment then you then take the lid off of the jar of your fully colonized mycelium substrate cake, and you bang it onto the bottom of the plastic box so that the cake falls out. And then you'll get the cake will come out in one solid lump, and it will then sit on the bottom of the humid plastic box. And you could maybe, depending on how big your plastic box is, you could probably fit, say, 4 at a time inside one box. So, and then you put the lid back on, and then you just leave it. But also you can put a reptile heating pad under the box, or even potentially on top of it, just to increase the temperature inside by a few degrees and keep the humidity level high. Because if the temperature goes down too much, then the water will condense and it will no longer be in the air anymore. So you've got a box of...
Can I interrupt for a second? Could you repeat again? I missed So are we adding water to the box, or is this part of the optional perlite?
You've already added perlite, but the perlite is completely dry. you now need to add also some water, but not very much. Just a small amount of water so that there's always
to the sides and bottom, kind of spreading it around, or just a little bit?
Just the bottom, I would say.
Just the bottom?
Yeah, just onto the perlite, basically. You're adding a mix of perlite and water into the jar. You could use vermiculite instead of perlite, but I think that it's probably better to use perlite. That seems to be far more accepted way of setting up a mushroom grow box, is to use perlite. So perlite and water, but it's what I said was you don't want to have so much water on the inside that there's any visible puddles of water on the bottom. That would be a bad thing. That would be a good way of attracting mold. So the water should be basically invisible on the bottom, but also very sufficiently present that it creates a very high humidity inside the box. If the air inside the box is dry, the mushrooms will never grow. It has to be humid. And it's easy to do. That's easy to do. As long as there's a small quantity of water on the perlite, and as long as there is some kind of reptile heater or some way of keeping it slightly warm, and also as long as the lid of the box is on sufficiently tightly that it doesn't just allow all the moisture out, then it will be very readily, you will create a humid environment inside the box, which is perfect for the mushrooms to grow in. So you've got your humid box, and it's got a number of fully colonized rice and vermiculite cakes sitting on the bottom of it. It's also a very good idea to have a small water atomizer with you, like a small spray bottle, which creates a very fine mist of water. And then you can use that to supplant the humidity inside the box on a regular basis. So all you need to do is open the box lid, say once a day, once every couple of days, just a small amount, open it and spray some fine mist of water into the box, and that will keep the humidity levels up. And I do recall reading somewhere, I'm not sure how true it is actually, but someone had said that one of the ways that the cakes know to fruit and start to produce mushrooms is if they have water evaporating off the surface. So it's good to get some tiny droplets of water to land onto your rice cake fungus, your fungus cakes, so that it can then evaporate off, and that will then promote production of mushrooms. So you've then created another transfer. You've moved your cakes from the jars into the plastic box, where they're then open to the humid air on the inside of the box. They will then sit like that for some period of time. It could be just a matter of days. It could be up to about 2 weeks. But if it's any longer than 2 weeks, that's kind of potentially a problem. You might have some bad genetics. You don't want to leave it too long in there before you're going to see some mushrooms. So after a certain period of time, they will start to form tiny, they're called pinheads, will start to form on the surface of your fungus cakes, which is like tiny round brown bumps will start to grow out of it, and they will get larger and larger, and within a couple of days so they start off as pinheads, then the next stage is I think called primordia, and then they become basically small mushrooms, and they become very easy to recognize as being mushrooms. So that process takes only about a week or 2 weeks from the earliest formation of tiny pinheads, which are only about 1 millimeter across on the surface of your fungus cakes. They will then rapidly start to grow into mushrooms, and within 2 weeks' time, I think it should be less than 2 weeks, you will have fully grown mushrooms protruding from the cakes. Now, a number of them will always naturally abort themselves, and they will stop growing before they get fully grown and before the cap of the mushroom opens out. And then other ones will continue growing all the way to full growth. And that's the really exciting time. Basically, especially the first time you do it, once you start to see pinheads, and once those pinheads start to grow into small mushrooms, that's the really exciting time. That's when your hard work that you've put into producing this has paid off, and you know that you're not going to fail at that point. You know that you've actually succeeded in growing mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
So then after like a week and a half has passed, you're then in a position to harvest your magic mushrooms from the surface of the cake. And that's really simple. You can just pick them off and store them either fresh, or you can dry them out. But the real full thing, that if you want to become a fully accomplished grower, the really good thing to do is to allow at least one mushroom to grow completely fully, so that the cap opens up until it's flat. So it goes from being round to being flat. And then the spores will start to drop out of the bottom of the cap, and they will coat everything. So the surface of the cake will go kind of black or blacky purple from the spores landing on it, and the stem of the mushroom will also get visible spore buildup all over it. And if you cut the top of the mushroom off and you put it onto a piece of clean silver foil and then leave it for 12 hours, then you have created a spore print. And then the whole process of growing mushrooms at that point has gone full circle, because the spore is the kind of pivotal point in this circular process. The process of growing mushrooms starts and ends with spores, basically. So to go the full way, you should take your own spore prints, but you don't need to do that, because there's always going to be a supply of spore syringes available from online companies. So you don't need to do that. If you want, you can just pull the mushrooms out of the cake, and then you can either store them in the fridge, you can eat them fresh immediately, or you can dry them out. And that is the full process of growing mushrooms in the most simple way that you can possibly do it. Any other way that you use, any other technique, has more steps in it than that. And each step, as we discussed, it's a potential for it to go wrong, a potential for it to become infected. So the reason this technique is so good for beginners is because it has the smallest number of individual steps from start to finish. So there you have it. That is how to grow mushrooms. If you follow that process down to the letter, then you will produce easily enough mushrooms to trip as hard as you want to, pretty much as regularly as you want to, and it's absolutely wonderful, basically.
One question there at the end. So if you do cut off the head of the mushroom, once one of them begins to release its spores and collect the spores, then, as you're saying, one could then reuse those spores, or not reuse, but use them to help create a new mycelium cake. How does one go about, say, like the transfer from like collecting them on the piece of paper, for example, where you've made a spore print? You would just load them into a water and the syringe.
Right, so that's the next step. That's how to create a spore syringe from a spore print.
Like, if you wanted to reuse it, would you need to do that, or is there another method too?
There are other methods of using a spore print to create a culture of mushrooms, but they are all more complicated and more advanced, more difficult to succeed in than creating a spore syringe. To create a spore syringe is basically very simple, very straightforward. You just need to scrape some of the spores off of your spore print into a small container of sterile water. So you could get, for example, just some spring water, and you could boil it for like a minute so it's absolutely sterile, and then allow it to cool down to room temperature, put it into a jar, and then you can literally, you just have to open up the spore print and maybe use something like a scalpel knife but again, you should clean the scalpel knife really well. Maybe sterilize it with a flame or rub it with some rubbing alcohol to get it absolutely sterile. You can then scrape some of the spores off of the surface of the spore print into the water, and then seal it back up again. And then you have, say, like a big jar of water with a load of spores floating around in it. Then you need to take a fresh syringe. So if you get syringes brand new, they tend to be pre-sterilized. I think they sterilize them, the supplier will sterilize them using an ultraviolet sterilizer, and then they pack them into like an airtight paper, an airtight packaging, so that they come out ready sterilized, which makes it nice and easy. You can then just take out a brand new syringe out of its packet and pull up some of this water with spores in it into the syringe, and then put the lid back on the syringe, and then you have a spore print. Then you have a spore syringe. And at that point, you're then in a position to start the whole process again from the beginning, because you can then use that spore syringe to inoculate more cakes. There are other ways of doing it, but these are more advanced techniques, and it's worth us doing a future recording to talk about some of the more advanced techniques, because there's a lot of them and they're very exciting and interesting, but they involve further ingredients. So one thing that is very useful to use is agar jelly. Do you know about using agar jelly in biological processes?
I don't know. What is it?
All right. So basically, agar is it's like a natural chemical. I think it's made of seaweed. I think it's a byproduct of some kind of seaweed or something like that. And it gelatinizes water. So it turns water into jelly. I think it's often marketed as vegan or vegetarian jelly, because normally the typical type of jelly that children eat is made with gelatin, which is an animal product. And so agar, it does the same thing to water in that if you add it to water, it makes the water solidify. But it's a plant product. And what you can do is get some agar and add it to water, and then add some nutrients to this agar water mix, and then allow that to solidify into you can either use small glass jars or small dishes, petri dishes, things like that. And then you can grow mycelium on the surface of the agar jelly. That's very, very useful for the more advanced techniques. And when you start to clone mushrooms and to isolate genetics, I think these are all very interesting things to go into, but maybe we should do a separate recording, because this is like a whole separate area. So it's like, I think that basic technique of creating rice cakes is a fully contained mushroom growing tech in its own right, and that kind of deserves one recording. And then maybe we could in the future do a separate recording and talk about some of the other techniques, which include things like using rye grains or popcorn kernels instead of rice flour. And also you can use liquid cultures, so you can grow mycelium inside a liquid instead of growing it inside a cake. There's lots of different techniques, and they open up new possibilities. But the one that I've just covered here is the simplest possible way of doing it.
Great. So we'll have this is our beginners episode.
Exactly. Yeah.
A future advanced techniques episode for.
Yeah. It's definitely worth in the future covering some more advanced techniques, but this is definitely the beginners episode.
Great. Well, glad to have it. You know, it's as you say, it's a very different conversation than we've had in the past, but it's it's a practical aspect of the Transcendent Knowledge podcast. I think it's a practical wing of it.
It certainly is. Yeah.
And here in the States, we're kind of looking with interested eyes at their various kind of public petitions and ballot measures to get psilocybin decriminalized at the least. In fact, they've passed them in the past few months in various cities, not in any states, but in the cities of Denver, Colorado, and Oakland, part of the Bay Area, and San Francisco. And then I think that there are various measures that people are working on in Oregon and California as well.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear about how that all progresses. In particular, I'm very interested to know what the practical real world outcome of it is, if anything. And I sense that there might not be any real outcome in the sense of I don't think that they're going to be allowed to openly sell magic mushrooms and any kind of like growing media, anything like that, which is currently illegal. I think it's more it's legal for personal use, and it's kind of you have to still keep it basically hidden, but that you just don't need to worry about any kind of criminal outcome of it. Whereas I would be more hopeful, I would more want to see an actual kind of legal market for it start to appear, as it has done in Holland. Like you can go into shops in Holland and you can buy. Not only can you buy, well, you can buy truffles, which is a slightly different form of fungus, which also produces the same chemicals to make you trip. But you can also buy things like liquid cultures and grow kits, which take all the difficulty out of growing them yourself. I don't think that is going to happen in. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure on exactly which places have legalized it, which places it's pending to become an issue and that kind of thing. But I'm certainly interested to see how that all progresses. I mean, who would have thought, even just 10 years ago, that ever would have happened in the United States? It's quite amazing, really.
It is, and I'm interested in looking into more what the details are, so perhaps we could discuss that more in the future as well.
Yeah, good idea.
My impression is that you say it's in the places where there have been ballot measures in these cities, Denver and Oakland, it is merely a decriminalization or a message to the law enforcement that they are not to. They're to treat it as very either as no priority or as low as possible priority. And but I also think that these are voter ballot measures, and so they've just been gotten their majorities in recent elections, and there's still a great deal to be done at the. Even having done this very limited measure, there's still time. It's not like these things immediately go into effect necessarily.
Right.
There's still the work of the city council members and things like that to actually put them on the books.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
So they have like a mandate, so to speak, from the people to do that. And the various lawmakers who help propose them and bring these measures to the ballot box are going to work on that, but it's not some immediate thing. Nor is it as far as I can tell, nor is it about selling. It's simply a decriminalization of possession.
You're right. Yes. Yeah. So it won't really have a very visible effect on. There won't be any kind of legal open market for them, but this is something that people can just do behind closed doors and just not have to worry about it.
That's my understanding at this point, though. I'd like to look into it more, and I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about the various the tactic here of trying to get this sort of measure passed. And I mean, if anything, it is also provoking an interesting discussion in the States about legalization and decriminalization, and what form that should take. That I think it would be. It's another topic that fits in very nicely with work that we have done in the past. And,
yes.
So that's a seed or a spore for future conversation.
Right, yes, definitely.